Margareth woke up, just like every other day, without rush, without purpose. The first rays of sunlight barely peeked through the heavy, dusty curtains she hadn't opened in years. The silence in the house was almost deafening, the kind of silence that ate away at her from the inside, like a ghostly presence that seeped into every room, every piece of furniture. The absence of João, her late husband, hung in the air like a permanent shadow. It had been 5 years since he passed, but for Margareth, it felt like yesterday. Time, for her, had stopped on that day. The few objects still decorating her living room were relics of a happy past, moments captured in old photographs, now covered by a fine layer of dust, just like the life she no longer lived. Each photo, each frame, echoed with laughter, hugs, and words that would never be spoken again. That emptiness, however, was all she knew now, a cruel but familiar companion. Margareth was alive, but only in theory. Her soul, she felt, had left with João. She moved through the house slowly, as if each step was just a formality, a duty she carried out until the moment she could finally lie down and wait for death. Her dull eyes wandered through the memories that filled the space. The sofa where João used to read his newspaper, the radio that played his favorite songs on Sunday afternoons. But now, everything was dead, just like the hope she once had. It was an endless cycle of loneliness and waiting, a clock ticking aimlessly, as if the world had forgotten her. That morning, however, something different happened. It wasn't the change she expected. Maybe the end of her own life, which she longed for with a mixture of resignation and nostalgia. No, what happened was more subtle but deeply unexpected. A sound, a faint, almost imperceptible noise, blending with the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. But Margareth noticed it because, for a long time, the quiet of her home hadn't been broken by anything other than the rustle of leaves or the creaking of old furniture. She paused for a moment, holding the cup of tea that had recently become her only morning companion. There was something out there, something that didn't belong to the still, quiet universe she had built around herself. Another knock, louder this time. Margareth set the cup down on the table with trembling hands and walked to the front door. Her heart, which had long seemed to beat without purpose, sped up almost uncomfortably, and she felt a tingling in her chest, something akin to curiosity, an emotion long forgotten. When she opened the door, what she saw was, at first, almost irrelevant. A small figure crouched on the ground. A dog, thin, dirty, its fur matted with mud and dust. Its eyes, however, were vivid, and they locked onto hers with an intensity that made her step back. That animal wasn't supposed to be there, she thought, feeling a slight discomfort at having her routine disturbed. "Where did you come from?" Margareth muttered, not expecting an answer. The dog wagged its tail, a faint thump against the ground, as if that simple gesture was all the energy it had left. It seemed as lost as she was, its fragile bones visible beneath its filthy skin. There was a hunger in it, more than just physical, a hunger for care, for company. Margareth stood there for a few more seconds, staring at the small creature before her. A part of her mind, the rational part that still clung on, wanted to close the door and return to her life of silence. After all, what could she, an old woman, offer to an animal that clearly needed more than she had to give? But she didn't close the door. Without knowing why, Margareth stepped forward, kneeling with difficulty to get closer to the dog. It looked back at her, and in its gaze, she saw something familiar. Perhaps it was loneliness. Perhaps it was pain. She couldn't say for sure. But at that moment, she saw her own reflection in the dog's eyes. Two lost souls, each waiting for the end in a different way. Margareth sighed. "Come on," she said, her voice sounding strange even to herself. The dog, hesitant, stood up on trembling legs and followed her into the house. She closed the door behind them, as if that act marked a turning point, something she didn't yet fully understand. Before we start the story, I'd like to know what city you're watching from. Tell me in the comments, and I'll leave a heart for you. The next few hours were silent, but in a way different from what Margareth was used to. She gave the dog some water, a bit of food from the fridge, and watched as it ate with a sad eagerness. There was something transformative in those gestures. Every piece of food she offered seemed to nourish something inside her too, a small spark of life she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what she would do with the dog. She didn't even know if it would stay. But for that night, it was there, and Margareth, for the first time in a long while, wasn't alone. As the dog curled up in a corner of the living room to sleep, Margareth sat in Joao's old armchair and looked at the animal. A thought crossed her mind, something she hadn't allowed herself to consider for years. What if life still had something to offer? That question, subtle and unsettling, planted itself in her mind like a seed. What Margareth didn't know was that this small, seemingly insignificant creature was about to change everything. Time seemed to move differently since the little dog came into Margaretha's life. Somehow, it brought movement to what had once been frozen. The house, once drowned in an almost tomb-like silence, was now interrupted by the soft sounds of paws on the floor, the gentle breathing beside the couch, a presence that, though discreet, filled the emptiness. The routine that had once seemed unbearable now had a lightness she couldn't explain. Margareth hadn't named the dog. There was something deliberate in that. Giving it a name would mean accepting that it was part of her life, that the small creature had a place there. And despite feeling something new growing inside her, she still resisted admitting it. It would be too risky. Each glance she cast at the dog reminded her of her own fragility, of how much she had already lost. She didn't know if she could bear to lose again. In the early days, she watched it from a distance without much interaction. It made itself comfortable in the corners of the house, laying its head between its paws, as if it knew it was only a temporary guest. Its eyes followed Margareth silently, with a mix of hope and patience she didn't understand. With every move she made, it waited, as if anticipating the next decision, the next step. Then, something changed. It was on a cold morning when Margareth woke up later than usual. As she came downstairs, she noticed the dog curled up by the kitchen door, shivering in the cold. During the night, it hadn't made a sound, no plea for help. It was there, resigned to its condition, without complaint. Margareth felt a tightness in her chest, as if seeing a reflection of herself in those tired eyes. Without thinking twice, she grabbed an old blanket from the closet and threw it over the dog. It stirred slightly, but didn't react with surprise, merely accepting the gesture as if it were natural. Margareth knelt beside it, her hesitant hand stroking the dirty, matted fur. The warmth of the animal's body rose into her palm, and she felt something break inside her. A wall she had built over the years, stone by stone, began to crumble slowly. She stood up quickly, as if fleeing from what she had just felt. She didn't want to get attached. She couldn't. Over the next few days, Margareth began to wonder where the dog had come from. There was no collar, no sign that it belonged to anyone. But somehow, it seemed familiar with the space, as if it knew where things were, as if it had been there before. The thought bothered her, but she pushed it aside. There was something comforting in its presence, and Margareth was willing to accept that, at least for now. One afternoon, as she sat on the couch with a cup of tea in her trembling hands, she watched the dog lying beside her. It was now clean, after a difficult bath, more for her than for it. Its fur, once tangled and muddy, was now soft to the touch, and its eyes, once dull, shone with a life Margareth couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, she felt a genuine desire to speak, to fill the space with words. "You had a home once, didn't you?" she whispered, almost not realizing she was speaking out loud. The dog, as if understanding, lifted its eyes to her, tilting its head slightly. The gesture made Margaretha's heart ache, and she turned away, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She thought of Joao. He had always wanted a dog, but Margareth never allowed it. She used to say that life as a couple was complicated enough without having to care for another being. Now alone, she saw how much she had missed out on because of that refusal. Perhaps if they had had a dog, the silence she now loathed wouldn't have been so devastating after his death. Perhaps the emptiness wouldn't have been so unbearable. On a particularly cold night, something unexpected happened. Margareth had left a small bowl of food for the dog in the kitchen and retreated to her room, as she did every night. But this time, as she lay down, she felt something different. The dog, silent as always, had snuck into the bedroom and was now lying at the foot of her bed. She didn't have the strength to tell it to leave. For the first time, she didn't sleep alone. Margareth began to feel time differently. The clock still marked the hours, but the days were no longer an endless cycle of waiting. There were small moments of warmth, of connection, and with that came a subtle unease. She was alive again, but with that came fear. The fear of loss, of loving something that could disappear. The doubt gnawing at her chest began to grow. Who was that dog? Where had it come from? She wondered if it belonged to someone who was looking for it. Maybe it had run away from a nearby home, and at any moment, someone would come knocking at her door to claim it. The thought disturbed her more than she cared to admit. One morning, while making coffee, Margareth heard something that made her pause in the middle of the movement. A knock at the door. She froze. It was almost as if fate was there, ready to take something from her again. Her heart raced, and her trembling hands clutched the dish towel tightly. She opened the door slowly, expecting the worst. But on the other side, there was no one, just a cold breeze sweeping the dry leaves from the sidewalk. She felt immediate relief, but also a deep sadness. What was she waiting for? That someone would come and take away the only being that had brought a little life to this dead house? Margareth closed the door carefully, and at that moment, something inside her changed. She knew, deep down, that the dog wasn't just a coincidence. There was a reason it was there with her. But what was it? From that day on, she decided that if the dog had chosen to stay, she would choose it too. Even though life was a cycle of losses, there was still love to be given. And somehow, that small being had brought it back to her. The mornings remained cold, but now there was a difference. Margareth, for the first time in years, woke up with a purpose, even if it was small, to care for the dog that, without warning, had become the only constant companion in her life. It didn't make much noise, but its presence was undeniable. Every day, it followed her more closely, its watchful eyes capturing her every move. And Margareth, who had grown accustomed to loneliness, now had someone depending on her again. But deep down, she knew that it was stirring up wounds that had never healed. She was starting to get attached, and that scared her. One morning, as she opened the old drawer of the sideboard in the living room, Margareth found an old photo album. It was the album of her wedding to Joao. The pictures, faded with time, showed a smiling couple holding hands, the future shining before their eyes. A future they believed to be endless, filled with plans, dreams, and laughter. She ran her trembling fingers over one of the photos, remembering how easily Joao could make her laugh, how he made her feel alive. But as she turned the pages, a deep sadness washed over her. Her eyes filled with tears, and she felt the weight of everything she had lost. The dog was lying beside her, watching in silence. Margareth knew it couldn't understand what those photos meant, but somehow, its presence seemed to bring comfort, as if it could sense the weight of her sorrow. Sitting there with the album in her lap and the dog at her feet, Margareth began to speak. Her voice was low, trembling, as if she were talking to Joao's ghost. "He would have liked you," she said, looking at the dog, which lifted its head at the sound of her voice. "Joao always wanted a dog, but I thought it would be too much responsibility. Funny, isn't it? Now, after all these years, I'm here taking care of you." The dog, as if knowing it was its turn to respond, rested its head in her lap. That simple gesture broke something inside Margareth. She never imagined she could feel that kind of connection again. But there she was, back to where she started, loving something she knew, deep down, she could lose. The days passed slowly, and over time, Margareth allowed herself to feel. She still avoided naming the dog, as if keeping it nameless would protect her from becoming even more attached. However, she knew that with each act of kindness, with every exchanged look, something was building between them. A bond, invisible but unbreakable. Then, on an afternoon when the wind blew strongly outside, something unexpected happened. Margareth had gone for a brief walk in the garden, while the dog ran around her, playing with the dry leaves the wind had stirred up. It was a sight she never thought she'd see again, joy in something so simple. Her steps were slow, her knees no longer holding up as they used to, but there was something comforting in the movement. Suddenly, the dog stopped abruptly, its body stiff, its gaze fixed on a distant point on the horizon. Margareth frowned, trying to understand what had disturbed it. It began to bark, something it rarely did, and ran towards a gate. Margaretha's heart raced. She didn't know what to expect, but she followed the animal with hurried steps, her breath now short with anxiety. As she approached the gate, she stopped perplexed. On the other side stood a figure she hadn't seen in a long time. A man, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the years, his skin marked by time, but his eyes hadn't changed. They stared at her as if time hadn't passed, as if they were recognizable in any circumstance. It was Carlos, the neighbor she hadn't seen in over a decade. He had lived next door with his wife, Helena, until everything changed. The memory of Helena, a victim of a swift and cruel cancer, came to Margaretha's mind with a painful weight. Carlos had disappeared after his wife's death, and no one had seen or heard from him since. It was as if he had been swallowed by his own grief, just as Margareth had been after Joao's passing. But there he was, standing before her, looking intently at the dog. "Is he mine?" Carlos's voice was barely a whisper, broken by the wind. Margaretha's world seemed to collapse in on itself. She looked at the dog, which was wagging its tail furiously, as if knowing something important was about to happen. Her mind spun, trying to process the sudden revelation. "He ran away months ago, and I thought I'd never see him again," Carlos continued, his voice trembling, now marked by emotion. "After Helena died, I lost everything, including him. He disappeared, and I didn't have the strength to look for him." Margareth felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. That dog, which she thought had been an unexpected gift from fate, wasn't truly hers. It belonged to someone who, like her, had lost everything. The fragile foundation she had begun to build collapsed in a second. Carlos knelt down, reaching out to the dog. To Margaretha's surprise, the animal ran to him, as if it had finally found its true home. The connection between them was undeniable, and Margareth, standing beside them, felt a wave of deep sadness wash over her. The dog wasn't hers. It never had been. She stood there in silence, watching the reunion. Her heart pounded heavily, crushed by the reality unfolding before her eyes. She would have to let it go. Carlos stood up, stroking the dog with a tenderness Margareth recognized. She knew what it was like to love something so much it hurt, so much that the loss seemed unbearable. But it was time to let the dog return to its rightful owner. "Thank you, Margareth," Carlos said, raising his eyes to meet hers. "You took care of him when I couldn't." His words of gratitude felt like knives in her chest. She knew she had to let go, but how could she? The dog had saved her from a deep loneliness, and now she would return to the emptiness. Margareth took a deep breath, and before she could say anything, the dog looked back at her, its eyes filled with something Margareth couldn't quite identify. Was it going to be a final goodbye? Margareth stood there, motionless, watching the dog that had become her only companion in recent months run back into the arms of its true owner. The conflicting emotions running through her heart were almost unbearable. She should feel relieved that Carlos had found the dog he'd lost. She should feel grateful for the time she'd had with it, for everything that small creature had brought into her life. But what Margareth felt, in fact, was an overwhelming emptiness, as if the little bit of life she had left was being torn away once more. Carlos remained there, crouched beside the dog, petting it with the same tenderness she had offered. The animal, in turn, looked back and forth between Carlos and Margareth, as if it understood that something deeper was happening between them, a decision that needed to be made. The cold wind of that afternoon rustled the leaves around them, and suddenly, Margaretha's world seemed once again wrapped in the same heavy, suffocating silence she thought she had left behind. "I didn't know where he was all this time, Margareth." Carlos's voice was hesitant, as if he too was grappling with something bigger than words could express. "He ran away right after Helena, after she passed. I looked for him, but he disappeared. When I lost him, it felt like I lost the last piece of my life. The last connection I had with her." Margareth knew that pain. Every word Carlos spoke cut through her like a knife because she knew exactly how he felt. She had lived that same sense of loss when Joao died, when all the connections that kept them alive had been broken. She looked at the dog, now gazing at her, and its large, vivid eyes seemed to be pleading for a decision. It belonged to Carlos, not her. And yet, Margareth couldn't say goodbye. She felt her throat tighten, her chest heavy. She didn't want Carlos to see the pain in her eyes, but at the same time, she felt a responsibility she hadn't expected. That dog, in some way, had brought Margareth back to life. It had rekindled the small flame she believed had been extinguished long ago. And now, watching it leave felt like a new wound, perhaps the last. Carlos, sensing the dilemma she faced, took a step towards her. "Margareth, I didn't know what I would do if I didn't find him. But now that he's here, seeing how he is with you, I don't know if he wants to come back to me." His words took her by surprise. She lifted her eyes, staring into Carlos's aged, tired face. He had lost as much as she had, and now, here they were, standing on the edge between loss and love, between holding on and letting go. The dog, as if understanding that its fate was being decided, took a few hesitant steps towards Margareth. It nudged its nose against her leg, a gesture of familiarity, as if to say, "I'm still here." Margareth bent down with difficulty, feeling her knees protest, and ran her hand through the dog's soft fur, the touch that for months had been the only thing capable of calming her. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, her heart racing, as if her soul was being split in two. Memories of Joao flooded her mind. What would he have done? Joao had always been more open to love than she was. He always said that life was meant to be shared, and that despite the losses, it was necessary to keep going, to make room for new bonds. Even after Helena's death, Joao would talk about Carlos, worrying about his isolation, saying that grief shouldn't swallow a person whole. Margareth had never believed that, until now. She slowly opened her eyes, feeling the tears welling up but refusing to let them fall. "Carlos," Margareth began, her voice trembling. "I know how much he means to you. I know how hard it is to lose someone you love, but I don't know if I can let him go." Carlos took a deep breath, his eyes also filled with emotion. "I understand, Margareth, more than you realize." Silence fell between them again, but this time, it wasn't the same empty silence as before. It was the silence of unspoken decisions, of emotions too deep for words. Margareth knew that the dog would have to make the decision for them. It wasn't a simple choice. The animal had lost its first owner, Carlos, but had found in Margareth a new home, a new purpose, just as she had found in it a reason to keep living. The dog, who had been watching them both, finally made its decision. It approached Margareth, lay down at her feet, and with a heavy sigh, closed its eyes. It was a gesture of complete trust, a gesture that broke Carlos's heart, but also brought an unexpected peace to Margareth. Carlos took a step back, his shoulders sagging under the weight of resignation. "It seems he's made his choice," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Margareth looked at him, her gaze filled with understanding and shared pain. I don't know how to thank you," Margareth murmured, still stroking the sleeping dog at her feet. Carlos shook his head. "There's no need to thank me. Just take care of him in the way I couldn't. And maybe someday when I'm ready, I could visit him." Margareth nodded, the tears finally falling from her eyes. She knew that this goodbye was both a farewell and a new opportunity. Carlos had allowed her to keep the dog, but there was more to that decision. She was, in some way, taking on a greater responsibility, not just for the dog, but for herself. She was choosing to live again. When Carlos finally left, Margareth felt a different kind of weight in the air. It wasn't the weight of loss, but the weight of life. Of a life that, despite everything, continued. She looked down at the dog, now sleeping peacefully, and realized that it was much more than just a companion. It was proof that love never truly disappears, even when everything seems lost. From that day on, Margareth began to open the curtains in her house, letting the light in. She started caring for the garden again, taking walks with the dog through the neighborhood streets. And for the first time in years, she felt something she had forgotten: hope. The days passed slowly, and over time, the routine Margareth had grown accustomed to with the dog began to transform. Every day, around 4 in the afternoon, she would look out the living room window, knowing exactly what she would see. Carlos would come down the street, his steps slow, his hands in his pockets, his head slightly bowed as if carrying the weight of an invisible burden. And, without fail, every day he would stop in front of the house, hesitate for a second, and then knock on the door. Margareth always opened before the third knock, because she was already expecting him. There was something comforting in the consistency of that visit, a small reminder that while life had changed, some things remained the same. Carlos came to take the dog for a walk. "Hi, Margareth," he would say, his voice always low and polite. "Can I take him for a walk?" And Margareth, already with the dog ready, would tie the little leash and hand him over to Carlos, watching as the dog wagged its tail in pure happiness. It was a quiet moment, but full of feelings. For Carlos, those daily walks were a lost connection, a piece of himself he was reclaiming for a few hours. And Margareth knew that, as much as the dog was now hers, Carlos needed him too. There was an untold story between them, an invisible line that connected them in a way she was still trying to understand. In the early days, she would stay by the window, watching as Carlos walked down the street with the dog by his side. He always moved slowly, talking to the animal as if it were an old friend. They walked the same streets every day, but for some reason, each step seemed more meaningful, more filled with emotion. When they returned, after half an hour, Carlos would bring the dog back to Margareth, give a brief smile, and leave without saying much. There was a routine in it, something comforting but also deeply sad. Margareth knew that Carlos was still struggling with his own losses, just as she was. Perhaps he would never fully heal from Helena's death. Perhaps no one ever truly gets over a loss like that. But in some way, those daily walks with the dog were the only thing Carlos had to hold on to. And gradually, Margareth began to realize that it wasn't just the dog that was being healed. Carlos was too. One afternoon, while waiting for Carlos to return with the dog, Margareth let her thoughts drift back to the days before Joao's death. She remembered how, even when he was sick, he still tried to be strong for her. He had that tired but loving smile that never failed to show when he looked at her. Joao knew the end was near, and Margareth, despite all her attempts at denial, knew it too. But they never talked about it. It was like a silent pact, where each other's presence was all they had left. The dog, in some way, reminded Margareth of Joao. Not because the animal was a replacement. Nothing and no one could take his place. But because, in its simplicity and loyalty, the dog filled the void left by Joao's absence in a way Margareth never expected. And now, Carlos was also part of that strange triangle, an invisible bond that united 3 wounded hearts. On that particular day, Carlos took longer to return from the walk. Margareth began to worry, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun began to set. Finally, she saw Carlos's figure in the distance, the dog happily trotting beside him. She sighed with relief, but something seemed different. Carlos was slower than usual, and when he finally reached the door, his eyes were red. "Are you all right?" Margareth asked, her voice filled with a concern she hadn't expected to feel. Carlos gave a slight, forced smile and looked at the dog. "Yes, it's just that today, he reminded me so much of Helena. I don't know why, but it's like he knows how much I miss her. He always stayed close to her, quiet, as if he knew she was sick." Margareth didn't know what to say. Words felt useless in that moment. Instead, she just watched as Carlos crouched beside the dog and stroked its fur, his eyes filled with an old longing. It was the same pain Margareth felt for João, a pain that never really went away. It just lingered there, waiting for moments of vulnerability to resurface and remind them of everything they had lost. That night, after Carlos left, Margareth sat in the armchair with the dog by her side and thought about what he had said. Life had a strange way of connecting people, of intertwining their stories in ways they could never predict. She and Carlos were strangers, united only by loss, but somehow, they now shared something deep and unexplainable. Both were trapped in a cycle of grief and love, and the dog was the bridge between them. Carlos's walks continued, day after day. Sometimes he stayed longer, sitting on the porch with Margareth while the dog rested beside them. They talked about the small details of life, like neighbors who had known each other for years, but they avoided delving into the depths of the pain that connected them. Both knew that what united them wasn't just words, but the shared silence, the mutual understanding that time didn't heal everything, but sometimes it offered something in return. And for both of them, the dog was that something. One day, after a longer walk, Carlos returned with a different look. He glanced at Margareth with an expression she hadn't seen in a while, something between sadness and relief. "Margareth, I wanted to tell you that I'm thinking of moving," he said suddenly, without preamble. "The house next door has too many memories, too many I can't let go of. I need a fresh start." The announcement caught her by surprise. Though Carlos had mentioned in some casual conversations that his house made him feel trapped, Margareth never believed he would actually leave. She felt a pang in her chest, a sense that something was slipping away from her again. "And the dog?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Carlos smiled a bittersweet smile. "He's yours now. I know that. He's already chosen his home, and it's here. I just needed these walks to say goodbye, to remind myself that it's possible to move on." Unable to respond, Margareth simply nodded. She understood, on a deep level, what he was saying. Carlos needed to set himself free, and the dog had helped him do that, just as he had helped Margareth rediscover life. But now, it was time for Carlos to walk his own path. That night, as Margareth petted the sleeping dog beside her, she allowed herself to cry. It wasn't the overwhelming grief of losing João, but the inevitable changes of life. She knew that, just as the dog had brought light into her darkness, it had also been the catalyst for Carlos's healing. And now, Carlos was ready to move forward, but she wasn't alone. The weeks that followed Carlos's announcement were marked by a strange silence. The dog, now officially part of Margaretha's life, settled into its new routine without the daily walks with Carlos. Margareth knew something was changing inside her, but she still didn't know how to name that feeling. It was as if time, once her relentless enemy, had learned to be kind to her, offering small moments of peace and acceptance. Carlos, as promised, gradually said his goodbyes. The house next door, which had once been the symbol of a life full of love with Helena, was now empty, up for sale. Every time he passed by to collect boxes or finish the last details, Margareth felt a pang of anticipatory longing, as if she were about to lose something important again. But unlike before, she felt stronger. She was no longer a woman on the edge of the end. Now, she was someone who had learned that love, even when broken, could be rebuilt in unexpected ways. One autumn afternoon, Carlos came for his final visit. There was nothing left to collect from the house next door. He was there just to say goodbye, for real this time, Margareth waited for him on the porch, the dog by her side, both calm, as if they knew that moment was final. Carlos approached slowly, his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slumped, but there was a serenity in his walk that Margareth hadn't seen in a long time. When he finally arrived, the two stood in silence for a moment, listening to the soft sound of the wind in the trees. "So, this is it," Carlos said with a timid smile. "I wanted to thank you, Margareth, for everything, for taking care of him, and, in a way, for taking care of me too." Margareth looked at him, feeling the words weigh in her throat, but she knew that nothing she said would express everything she was feeling. Instead, she simply nodded, and the silence between them was filled with understanding. Carlos knelt beside the dog and petted it one last time. The dog, now robust and healthy, licked Carlos's hand as if it knew this was a goodbye. Carlos chuckled softly, his eyes brimming with tears. "He was my connection to Helena, but now he's yours, Margareth. And that's how it should be." The weight of the words hung in the air. Margareth, who for so long had feared new losses, now realized that the cycle of life was beyond her control. Things came and went, people left, but love left permanent marks. Carlos stood up, wiped his eyes discreetly, and turned to leave. Before he left, however, he looked back at her one last time. "You'll be okay, Margareth. I know that." She tried to smile, but the sadness still touched her. "You too, Carlos. Take care of yourself." When Carlos disappeared down the street, Margareth felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He was another loss in her life, but this time it wasn't a final, tragic loss. It was a conscious choice, a necessary closure for both of them. The dog, as always, remained by her side, never looking away. Margareth glanced at it and smiled. "Looks like it's just the two of us now, huh?" And for the first time, she realized just how much that comforted her. The months passed, and Margareth began to rediscover herself in ways she had never imagined. Slowly, she began to open more than just the curtains of the house. Every morning, she felt a new energy as she walked the dog through the neighborhood streets, greeting neighbors she had ignored for years. Winter came and went, and with it, Margareth saw a kind of acceptance and peace blossom within her that she hadn't felt since Joao's death. She now knew that love didn't die with people. It transformed, changed shape, but it was always present. And that little dog, who had appeared at her door as a last breath of hope, had been the catalyst for that transformation. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch with the dog lying by her side, Margareth looked out at the horizon and thought of Joao. The memories, once painful, now came with a gentle nostalgia. She knew that, in some way, he was still there. In the small joys, in the quiet moments, in the soft breeze that caressed her face. She took one of the old photos she had kept in her pocket, the same one she had avoided looking at directly so many times. It was a picture of Joao holding her hands, the two of them young and full of life. Margareth smiled, her eyes filled with tears, but this time, without pain. Only gratitude. "I'm okay, Joao," she whispered, more to herself than to the wind. "I'm okay." The dog, sensing the soft tone of her voice, got up and rested its head on Margaretha's lap, as if it knew that moment required presence, not words. That night, Margareth felt a deep peace. She lay down in bed with the dog at her feet, as always, but something was different. The weight of loneliness had lessened. The emptiness was filled with something greater than herself. And as she closed her eyes, for the first time in years, she fell asleep with a slight smile on her lips. In the silence of the night, amidst the soft sounds of the dog's breathing, Margareth dreamed. And in that dream, she was holding hands with Joao, walking through a green field under a cloudless sky. The love she thought she had lost enveloped her in every possible way. And she knew now that she had never really lost it. Margareth learned that love, even when wounded by loss, can be reborn in the most unexpected forms. With the dog by her side, she found a new way to live, to remember, and finally to move forward. Now, her journey continued, not as someone waiting for the end, but as someone who had rediscovered the value of every moment, of every heartbeat. And above all, Margareth knew that the cycle of life, of love and loss, was infinite. But she was no longer alone. Have you had, or do you have a special pet in your life? Tell us in the comments what their name is. And if you enjoyed this touching story, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories full of love and emotion.